For a man who had spent 15 years thriving in the cacophony of competence, the ringing phones, the urgent staccato of keyboards, the low hum of 100 conversations converging in a downtown high-rise, the silence of suburbia was a physical weight. For David, laid off and repurposed into a stay-at-home father, this silence was his new office. His world had shrunk to the pristine, repeating architecture of the Willow Creek Estates development, a place so new it still smelled of fresh paint and sod. Here, the only deadline was his daughter Mia's nap time, the only metric of success a clean plate at lunch. This was his new reality, a life sentence of quiet desperation, and the only escape was the long, winding walks through its unnervingly perfect streets. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The sun was a merciless white disk in a cloudless sky, bleaching the color from the identical beige houses of Willow Creek. Every lawn was a perfect emerald rectangle, every driveway an unblemished sheet of pale concrete. It was the kind of enforced perfection that David was starting to find more unsettling than the urban chaos he missed. "Can we go to the duck pond, Daddy?" Mia's small hand was a warm, trusting weight in his. At 6 years old, she was the anchor in the turbulent sea of his new life, the one constant that gave him purpose. "You bet, Sweet Pea," he said, forcing a smile. "We'll take the long way." The long way was his daily ritual, a meandering tour through the development's circulatory system of cul-de-sacs and crescents. The names were offensively idyllic: Whispering Pines Lane, there were no pines; Meadowlark Court, there were no meadows; Serenity Drive. The only sound was the rhythmic slap, slap, slap of his running shoes on the pavement and Mia's occasional happy chatter. The silence between her words was vast and absolute. No dogs barked, no neighbors were out gardening. It was a community holding its breath. He'd lost his job as a senior project manager 3 months ago. Restructuring, they'd called it, a bloodless corporate term for eviction. His wife, Emily, a resident doctor whose hours were as long as his were now empty, had been supportive. "It's a chance for you to be with Mia," she'd said, her logic as clean and sharp as a scalpel. "We'll be fine." But David didn't feel fine. He felt hollowed out, his identity excised. He'd gone from managing a team of 20 to managing the whims of a 6-year-old. He loved his daughter more than life itself, but the role of stay-at-home dad felt like a costume he couldn't take off. They rounded a bend onto Primrose Path. A row of identical black mailboxes stood like stoic sentinels at the edge of the curb. And that's when he saw it. Stretched across the pristine, sun-drenched sidewalk ahead of them was a shadow. It was long, impossibly long and thin, shaped distinctly like a tall, slender man. Its edges were unnaturally sharp, a slash of absolute black against the bright concrete. It was cast as if from someone standing just behind the mailboxes, leaning out to watch them. But there was no one there. David stopped walking, his hand tightening on Mia's. He scanned the area. The sky was empty. The houses were blank-windowed and silent. The nearest tree was a decorative sapling 50 feet away, its own shadow a small, trembling puddle at its base. There was no flagpole, no telephone pole, nothing that could cast such a precise anthropomorphic shape at that angle. The shadow was utterly, profoundly still. It didn't waver in the light breeze that rustled the professionally landscaped shrubs. It didn't have the fuzzy, soft edges of a real shadow. It was a void, a patch of wrongness stitched onto the fabric of the afternoon. "What is it, Daddy?" Mia asked, looking up at him. "Nothing, Sweet Pea. Just thought I saw something." He blinked, rubbed his eyes. It had to be a trick of the light, a heat haze distortion. The oppressive sameness of the geometry here probably created weird optical illusions. He was tired. He hadn't been sleeping well, his mind a hamster wheel of anxieties about their mortgage and his dwindling severance. He looked back at the spot. It was gone. The sidewalk was just a blank, sun-bleached canvas. The space behind the mailboxes was empty. There was nothing. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. "Seeing things," he muttered. He squeezed Mia's hand and they continued their walk toward the duck pond, the artificial centerpiece of their artificial community. But he couldn't shake the image, the starkness of it, the sourceless, silent, watching shape. For the rest of the walk, David found himself looking over his shoulder, scanning the empty lawns and silent houses, searching for the source of a shadow that was no longer there. The suburban silence no longer felt empty. It felt observant. The sighting was not a one-time event. It became a feature of their walks, a silent, unwelcome companion. 2 days later, it was there again. This time, it lay sprawled across the perfect, cross-thatched lawn of a corner house, stretching from behind a meticulously sculpted boxwood hedge. Again, the shape was undeniable. A tall, thin man, arms at his sides, perfectly still. David slowed his pace, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He squinted, trying to will a person into existence behind the hedge, a lanky teenager or a gardener taking a break. There was nothing. He took a single step off the curb to get a better angle, and like a soap bubble bursting, it vanished. The lawn was just a lawn. The next day, it was painted against the blank sidewall of a 2-story model home, a long, dark stain that seemed to defy the sun's position in the sky. It was always at a distance, always on the periphery. It never moved, it never threatened, but its presence was a constant, low-grade hum of dread. It was the visual equivalent of a sound just outside the range of hearing, felt more than heard. David began to live in a state of hypervigilance. His walks with Mia, once a small pocket of peace, became missions of paranoid surveillance. He'd scan every surface, every angle, looking for it. The fear was a coiling snake in his gut. Was he losing his mind? Was the stress of unemployment manifesting as a recurring hallucination? He was standing at a crosswalk, waiting for a non-existent car, when Mia gave the hallucination a name. She pointed a small finger toward an empty park bench across the street. Lying on the ground, stretching away from the bench's base, was the shadow. "Daddy," she said, her voice small and matter-of-fact, "the quiet man is watching us again." A spike of ice shot through David's veins. He knelt down, trying to keep his voice even. "What do you mean, honey? Who is the quiet man?" Mia didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the shadow. "The tall shadow," she said simply, "the one that doesn't have a person." She said it with the innocent clarity of a child stating an obvious fact, like the sky is blue or dogs say woof. It was this untainted observation that terrified David more than anything. He wasn't imagining it. It was real, real enough for a 6-year-old to notice and name. The confirmation didn't bring relief. It brought a tidal wave of a new, more potent fear. This wasn't a symptom of his anxiety. It was an objective phenomenon, an entity. The still shadow, he started calling it in his head. His paranoia became methodical. He began to run tests, a scientist in a lab of suburban dread. One day, he deliberately turned left on a street they never took. 2 blocks down the new route, there it was, stretched out from behind a for sale sign in an empty lot. The next day, he took Mia for a walk at 9 in the morning instead of their usual 3 in the afternoon. As the cool morning sun cast long, natural shadows from the houses, he saw it cutting across them at an impossible angle, darker and sharper than the rest, a slash of obsidian on a gray canvas. The most unnerving test was when he decided to walk their usual route backward. He told Mia they were playing a silly game. As they walked, facing the way they'd come, he kept glancing over his shoulder, and there it was, far ahead of them, waiting at the next corner. It wasn't following him. It was anticipating him. It wasn't a pursuer. It was a silent, territorial warden, and these streets were its prison yard. Under the anemic, orange glow of the identical streetlights that lined Willow Creek's every curb, the still shadow became bolder, its physics more overtly impossible. One night, after putting Mia to bed, David stood at his living room window, staring out at the empty street. He saw it. It was lying flat in the middle of the asphalt, directly beneath a streetlight, in a spot that should have been the most brightly illuminated. It was a hole in the light, a perfect, man-shaped silhouette of absolute blackness where no shadow could possibly exist. It looked as if someone had painted it there with a bucket of Vantablack. As he watched, a car turned onto the street, its headlights sweeping across the road. The beams passed right over the shape, illuminating the asphalt on either side, but not the shadow itself. It seemed to swallow the light. His hands were trembling. He had to tell Emily. She came home late, smelling of antiseptic and exhaustion. He waited until she had eaten and showered, trying to find the right words, the right tone. He failed. "There's something out there, Em," he began, his voice tight and frantic. "A shadow. It follows me on my walks. Mia sees it too. She calls it the quiet man." Emily sat on the sofa, her expression a careful mixture of sympathy and clinical concern. "A shadow? David, what do you mean?" He tried to explain. The sourcelessness, the stillness, its impossible appearances under the streetlights. With every word, he could feel himself sounding more and more unhinged. He saw the shift in her eyes, from listening to her husband to assessing a patient. "Honey," she said, her voice soft and placating, "you've been under an incredible amount of stress. Losing your job, moving here, being a full-time dad, it's a huge adjustment. Our minds can play tricks on us when we're anxious and tired." "It's not a trick," he snapped, louder than he intended. "Mia sees it." "Mia has a huge imagination, and she's incredibly attuned to your moods," Emily countered gently. "If you're anxious and looking for something, she'll pick up on that. Maybe you should talk to someone, a professional." The suggestion felt like a slap. "She thinks I'm crazy." The chasm between them yawned, wide and dark. She was the voice of reason, of the sane world he felt was slipping away. Desperation made him reckless. The next day, he saw the still shadow stretched against the side of a neighbor's garage. He whipped out his phone, his fingers fumbling with the camera app. He snapped a dozen photos, his heart hammering. He zoomed in, swiping through the pictures with a growing sense of dread. Nothing. The photos showed a perfectly normal sunlit garage. In some, there was a faint discoloration, a slight darkening of the pixels that could easily be dismissed as a lens flare, a digital artifact, or a smudge on the siding. There was no stark, man-shaped void, no proof. The lack of evidence was a new kind of terror. It wasn't just that something was watching him. It was that the world had conspired to keep it a secret, to make him the sole, unbelievable witness. He was alone with it. The feeling of a game, of a distant observer, ended the evening it came home. David was washing dishes, looking out the kitchen window into their own backyard. The sun was setting, casting long, golden fingers of light across the lawn. In the center of the yard stood a young maple tree they'd planted when they moved in, its trunk no thicker than his wrist. And stretching from the base of that sapling, reaching almost to the patio door, was the still shadow. It was long, emaciated, and undeniably man-shaped, a grotesque elongation that the tiny tree could not possibly cast. It lay on his grass. It touched his property. The violation was visceral, a cold hand squeezing his heart. This wasn't a phenomenon of the streets anymore. It had a destination. It had followed him to his door. He backed away from the window, his breath catching in his throat. The next day, Mia refused to play in the yard. She stood at the sliding glass door, her little hands pressed against the pane. "I don't want to go out there," she whispered. "Why not, sweet pea? It's a beautiful day." "The quiet man is too close now," she said, a tremor in her voice. "His shadow is touching our house." That night, Mia woke up screaming. David and Emily rushed into her room to find her sitting bolt upright in bed, eyes wide with terror, pointing at the empty corner of her room. "He was watching," she sobbed. David's protective instincts, a fierce and primal force, went into overdrive, mixing with his own paralyzing terror. This thing, whatever it was now frightening his child. It had crossed a sacred line. He became a neighborhood detective. He started taking his trash out at the same time as his neighbors, trying to strike up casual conversations. "Ever see anything weird around here?" he'd ask, trying to sound nonchalant. He was met with blank stares, or talk about the HOA's strict rules on lawn ornaments. He turned to the digital neighborhood, the Willow Creek Estates community forum. The page was a monument to suburban ennui. Complaints about people not bringing in their garbage cans fast enough, debates over the best local pizza, lost cats. He spent hours scrolling, his eyes burning, searching for any keyword: shadow, strange, creepy, watcher, feeling. He found it buried deep, a post from 8 months ago, before they had even moved in. A user named Sleepless in Suburbia had written, "Does anyone else get a creepy feeling at night? Sometimes I see weird shadows from the streetlights. Probably just my imagination." The post had one reply: "Get better blinds, LOL." And then nothing. The user had never posted again. A single, dismissed breadcrumb in a digital wilderness. It was enough. He wasn't the first. He was just the one it had settled on. The sanctuary was breached. One evening, with all the curtains drawn and the doors locked, David was walking from the kitchen to the living room. As he passed the front door, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A sliver of black, impossibly dark, had slid across the thin crack of light at the bottom of the door. His heart seized. He lunged for the door, tore it open, and looked out into the orange-lit emptiness of his porch and the street beyond. Nothing, not a soul. Not a leaf stirring. He slammed the door shut, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It was testing the locks. Later that night, the true horror began. He was in the living room with Emily, who was reading a medical journal. A floor lamp in the corner cast their shadows against the far wall. David glanced at them. Emily's shadow was normal, a soft-edged gray silhouette. His own shadow, however, was subtly wrong. It was too tall, its shoulders were too sharp, and it was too still. When he shifted in his chair, the shadow mimicked his movement, but with a terrifying, fractional delay, like a bad video stream. It was a mimic, a parasite that had attached itself to his own reflection of light. "Em," he whispered, his voice hoarse, look at my shadow." She looked up from her journal, glanced at the wall, and then back at him. "What about it?" "It's wrong. It's not moving right. It's too dark." She sighed, a sound of infinite weariness. "David, it's a shadow. That's how shadows work." "No." He stood up, and the mimic shadow stood with him, its movements a horrifyingly close but not quite parody. "This is it. It's in the house." His sense of safety was not just shattered, it was annihilated. He couldn't escape it. He began an obsessive ritual, moving lamps, turning on every single light in the house until it was as bright as a hospital operating theater. He felt constantly watched, even in the windowless downstairs bathroom. The feeling was a physical pressure, a weight on his skin. His anxiety spiraled into a raw, frantic state of terror. Emily found him an hour later, standing in the middle of the living room, sweating, just staring at the wall. The confrontation that followed was inevitable, a brutal collision of their two separate realities. "This has to stop," she finally said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and frustration. "You're not sleeping, you're not eating. You're scaring me, David, and you're scaring Mia." "It's real, Emily. Why won't you believe me?" he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I believe that you are terrified," she said, her eyes welling with tears, "and that's why I'm giving you a choice. You will see Dr. Matthews, the therapist I recommended, or I'm taking Mia to my sister's for a while. I can't have her in this house while you're like this. I can't." The ultimatum was a death blow. He was being offered a choice between being labeled crazy or losing his family. The still shadow had not only invaded his home, it was now methodically dismantling his life. Emily's ultimatum pushed David past the edge of panic and into a cold, desperate clarity. If he couldn't prove its existence to the outside world, he had to understand it for himself. He needed an explanation beyond, "I'm going crazy." He channeled the project manager he used to be. He opened his laptop, not to search for jobs, but to launch an investigation. He ignored the forums and dug deeper into county archives, digital land deeds, and historical surveys of the area. He needed to know what Willow Creek Estates was built on. The results were anticlimactic and, in their own way, more terrifying. The land hadn't been an ancient burial ground. There was no forgotten asylum, no scene of a famous tragedy. For over a century, it had been nothing, just an empty, undeveloped tract of scrubland passed over by generations of developers. It was a blank space on the map. And that, he realized, was the key. The entity wasn't the ghost of a person. It wasn't tied to a traumatic event. It was more elemental. It was a genius loci, a spirit of the place. But the place had been a void, a quiet, unobserved, still patch of land. It was a shadow without a source, waiting. Then came Willow Creek Estates. Mankind had arrived and imposed a hyper-ordered, rigidly patterned reality onto the emptiness. They created a perfect grid of predictable life. The repeating house models, the identical streetlights clicking on in perfect synchrony, the obsessive routine of suburban existence. They had, in effect, built a massive stage and flooded it with predictable sources of light. They had given the still shadow a canvas on which to finally manifest. It wasn't a predator in the traditional sense. It was a territorial phenomenon drawn to the very things that defined this place: routine, observation, and quiet desperation. It was drawn to the solitary walker, the man whose daily rhythm of anxious pacing was as predictable as the sunrise. It wasn't following him, David, specifically. It was a feature of the landscape, and he, in his isolation and fear, had become the perfect focal point. His terror was the lens that brought it into sharp relief. He thought back to its appearances. It was always near points of artificial repetition: the row of mailboxes, the identical streetlights, the manicured hedges. Even, he now realized with a jolt, the little black domes of his neighbor's security cameras. It thrived in places of manufactured order and observation. It was the ghost in the suburban machine. He wasn't being haunted by a person. He was being haunted by the soul of the suburb itself. David knew he couldn't run. Moving would solve nothing. The entity wasn't attached to him. It was attached to the place. And this was his home. He couldn't get help because no one would believe him. He had to confront it, not with violence or with rituals, but by changing the terms of engagement. Fear and observation were its nourishment. He had to starve it. That evening, he waited until Emily was home. She was quiet, packing a small overnight bag for Mia, the air thick with unspoken tension. Her ultimatum hung between them. "I'm going for a walk," David said, his voice calmer than it had been in weeks. Emily looked at him, her eyes full of worry. "David, don't." "I have to," he said. "Let me do this. Keep Mia inside." He walked out into the twilight. He didn't take his usual route. He walked with purpose, his destination a place where he had felt its presence most acutely, a barren cul-de-sac at the far end of the development, containing only a single, stark streetlight. As he entered the circle of concrete, the streetlight clicked on, floating the space with its sickly orange glow. And there it was, waiting. It stretched from the base of the metal pole, a long black figure lying on the ground, pointing directly at him. His first instinct was to flinch, to feel the familiar spike of adrenaline, but he forced it down. He stopped at the edge of the cul-de-sac. He took a deep breath, the cool night air steadying him. Instead of running, instead of trying to photograph the unphotographable, he did the one thing he had never done. He turned his body to face the empty space beside the streetlight, the spot where a physical body would need to stand to cast such a shadow. He looked directly at the absence. He didn't shout, he didn't plead. He spoke to the empty air, his voice calm, firm, and resonant in the stillness. "I see you," he said. "I know what you are." He took a step forward, into the cul-de-sac. This is my walk. This is my street. This is my home. He looked down at the motionless shape on the ground, then back at the emptiness that was its source. "You are just a shadow," he said, infusing the words with all the conviction he could muster. "You feed on fear, and I am not afraid of you anymore. You have no power here." The climax was not an explosion, but an implosion. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the edges of the still shadow seemed to flicker, like a faulty projection. The absolute blackness wavered, losing its impossible sharpness. It began to recede. It didn't vanish in a blink. It pulled back, shrinking slowly toward the base of the streetlight, like a tide of darkness withdrawing from the shore. The oppressive chill in the air dissipated, replaced by the simple coolness of the night. The intense, suffocating feeling of being watched faded, leaving only a faint, hollow echo. He had not destroyed it. He had asserted his own existence. He had refused to be the audience for its silent, terrifying play. He had simply stood up and walked off the stage. David walked back into his house, and for the first time in weeks, it felt like a home. The oppressive sense of an interior presence was gone. The shadows cast by his own lamps were just that, soft, normal, harmless patches of gray. Emily was standing in the hallway, the small bag for Mia still at her feet. She looked at his face and saw not the frantic, haunted man of the last few months, but the husband she knew. The weariness was there, but the raw terror was gone. "It's okay," he said, and the simple words carried a universe of weight. "It's going to be okay." He didn't try to explain the elemental nature of the stillness or his confrontation with an absence. He just told her he had faced what was scaring him and that it was over. She might never fully understand or believe what he had experienced, but she saw the profound change in him. She saw his confidence return, his shoulders unhunch from their defensive posture. She quietly unpacked Mia's bag. The immediate crisis was over. David settled into his new life, but with a new perspective. He didn't find another corporate job. He embraced his role as Mia's father, not as a demotion, but as his purpose. Their daily walks resumed, but they were different. They were no longer exercises in fearful surveillance, but acts of defiant presence. He walked with his head held high, his and Mia's laughter filling the suburban silence, reclaiming the streets as their own. The still shadow was not gone forever. He knew that. Months later, driving home after dark, he passed the empty bus stop at the entrance to Willow Creek Estates. For a fleeting second, he saw it. A long, impossibly still shadow cast from the empty bench, a silent watcher on the edge of the light. David met its non-gaze with a steady one of his own. There was no fear, only acknowledgement. Then he turned his attention back to the road and drove on. He understood now. It was a part of the place, a silent feature of the manicured landscape, an entity that only gained power when you stared into the darkness and allowed it to stare back. He had learned to live with it. He had learned to cast a shadow of his own. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.